We start with a simple paradox that quietly upends certainty. Most people spend their lives collecting answers, but they never learn how to ask the right questions. This video will show why questions often matter more than answers and how an inquiry can change the course of a life, a conversation, or a civilization. Listen closely because the first question you ask will change how you hear every subsequent answer. Questions shape the shape of our thinking more than answers ever do. A single question can open up a whole landscape of possibilities where absent questions create narrow tracks of habit. When we understand the power of asking, we gain access to new ways of seeing, new conversations, and new kinds of courage that answers alone rarely supply. That is the secret architects of change have always known and used. Socrates is the historical archetype of a questioner who refused easy answers. He wandered Athens asking uncomfortable questions until people discovered their own contradictions and assumptions. The Socratic method is not about winning debates, but about evoking clarity and self-knowledge through disciplined inquiry. That method turns conversation into a mirror, showing hidden beliefs in stark, illuminating ways. There is a moral force to good questions that is easy to overlook. The right question can be an act of compassion that helps someone see themselves more clearly. Socratic questioning is patient and persistent, probing assumptions and demanding reasons without cruelty. That gentle pressure has toppled intellectual complacency and created a tradition of reflective thought across centuries. Modern thinkers have refined Socrates into tools we can use today in business, education, and therapy. Good leaders ask better questions than their competitors because questions reveal opportunities and risks that answers obscure. In classrooms and boardrooms, inquiry opens possibilities instead of shutting them down. That shift from answer-centric to question-centric thinking is quietly reshaping institutions right now. Science itself is structured around questions that insist on evidence and doubt. Researchers do not seek the comforting answer, but the question that will reveal an experiment's truth. A single, well-asked scientific question can redirect entire fields and reorganize funding, careers, and public policy. Curiosity, framed by disciplined inquiry, is where progress actually begins. Neuroscience now shows that curiosity literally rewires attention and memory toward what we seek to learn. When we ask questions, our brains release chemicals that make learning stick and curiosity flourish. This biological feedback loop explains why actively questioning transforms knowledge into wisdom more effectively than passively absorbing answers. The body and mind are aligned when inquiry becomes a habit. Not all questions are created equal, therefore matters deeply for what they produce. Closed questions narrow conversation into yes or no answers, while open questions expand thought and invite exploration. Learning to craft open, curious, non-judgmental questions is a skill that multiplies understanding. The difference between asking "did that work?" is philosophical in consequence. There are questions that lead outward towards systems and questions that lead inward towards self-discovery. Both matter, but they play different roles in forming a wise life. Sociopolitical questions reveal structures that shape our possibilities, while existential questions expose the narratives that shape our identity. Balancing both kinds of inquiry is the daily task of thoughtful living. Self-discovery questions are simple and devastatingly effective when asked with brutal honesty. Questions such as, "What do I truly fear?" and "What am I avoiding right now?" can unravel comfortable illusions. These questions are like tools in a therapist's kit because they force a person to confront patterns and narratives. When practiced regularly, self-inquiry changes the architecture of personal identity and choice. Curiosity and questions are intimately linked but distinct in important ways that matter. Curiosity is the emotional drive, while a question is the articulated path that directs that drive towards something specific. Without questions, curiosity can dissolve into distraction or random novelty seeking. The refinement of curiosity into precise inquiry is where discovery becomes deep and lasting. Questions also function as strategic tools in power dynamics and negotiations. The person who controls the questions often frames the terms of the debate and shapes outcomes subtly. This is why propaganda, advertising, and politics invest so much energy in question framing. Understanding this dynamic makes citizens and workers less vulnerable to manipulation. There are cultural taboos around certain kinds of questions, and those taboos shape what can be discussed openly. Societies invent questions that are allowed and questions that are forbidden, and that invention determines what knowledge circulates. Asking taboo questions can catalyze social change, but it can also invite backlash and isolation. Recognizing which questions are dangerous and why is part of becoming an effective inquirer. Practical techniques for asking better questions exist and are teachable to anyone willing to practice. Begin by replacing why with how and what when you need operational clarity and evoke alternatives instead of conclusions. Another practical trick is to delay judgment and ask follow-up questions that deepen rather than end the conversation. Those small habits reshape discussions into explorations rather than contests. A discipline I call the pause questioning method buys time for deeper thought before rushing to conclusions. Pausing for 3 breaths and then asking one precise question reduces reactivity and increases insight. This practice is simple to learn and hard to forget because it rewires your conversation habits. Over weeks, it transforms everyday exchanges from reflexive rebuttals into thoughtful inquiry. Asking better questions also requires embracing ignorance as a resource rather than a liability. Admitting we do not know opens space for real curiosity to enter and for others to contribute wisdom. Intellectual humility is a practice that converts uncertainty into fertile soil for inquiry. Many great discoveries began with someone confessing ignorance and asking a bold, vulnerable question. There are questions that build teams and questions that build isolation, and leaders must learn to distinguish between them. Inclusive questions invite participation, while rhetorical questions often exclude and intimidate. Skilled leaders craft questions as invitations that distribute power rather than concentrate it. That technique turns meetings into laboratories of collective intelligence rather than theaters of authority. In personal relationships, questions can either open empathy or close it down depending on tone and curiosity. Genuine questions that seek to understand foster connection far more reliably than statements that assert judgment. Practicing reflective listening and asking clarifying questions turns conflict into an opportunity for discovery. Those conversational shifts have saved marriages, careers, and friendships when answers alone could not. Questions are the engine of creativity because they invite alternatives that answers tend to bury. In art and design, asking, "What if we flipped this?" often leads to the most innovative results. Creative questioning is fearless about failure because it understands that bad experiments are necessary steps toward breakthroughs. That mindset separates iterative makers from perfectionist stasis. Education systems often reward the recall of answers rather than the craft of asking, and that tendency limits potential. Students can be trained to memorize facts, but rarely trained to formulate piercing questions. If schools taught question crafting as a core skill, generations would be better prepared to navigate uncertainty and complexity. The curriculum of tomorrow must shift from answers to inquiry. Technology amplifies questions by surfacing information instantly, but it also cheapens curiosity if we rely only on search results. A quick answer from a screen can reinforce shallow patterns unless paired with deeper questioning. The best use of technology is as a companion for sustained inquiry, not as a replacement for thinking. Tools should extend our capacity to ask better questions rather than shorten the habit. The cultural value of questions also shows up in history when revolutions began with a single disruptive question. Abolition, suffrage, and civil rights movements all started when someone publicly asked uncomfortable ethical questions. Those questions forced societies to confront contradictions between ideals and lived reality. When enough people begin asking a new, persistent question, institutions must respond or crumble. Philosophers themselves disagree about whether questions ever reach final answers, and that disagreement is part of philosophy's enduring value. Sometimes the point is not to conclude, but to refine the space of possible thought. This ongoing inquiry produces humility, nuance, and intellectual generosity because it trains the mind to live with ambiguity rather than burn it away. A life shaped by questions is more resilient to crisis. Practically speaking, cultivate curiosity by keeping a question journal and reviewing it weekly for patterns. Write down surprising observations and turn them into experiments that test your assumptions in the real world. Another practical habit is to adopt a beginner's mind each morning. Asking what you can learn today as if nothing were certain. These small rituals accumulate into a radically different life perspective. Try the three-question practice before important decisions. What do I know? What do I not know? And what question changes everything? Those prompts focus attention on uncertainty rather than illusion of control. By practicing that triad, you replace anxiety with productive curiosity, and you invite the right people and resources into your process decision. Making becomes less about certainty and more about wise exploration. The habit of asking also supports moral imagination by forcing us to consider perspectives other than our own. Empathy grows when questions illuminate experiences we cannot inhabit directly. Asking, how might this feel to them, expands our moral circle and reduces harm born of assumption. That practice transforms policy and personal relationships in subtle, powerful ways. There are dangers in questionlessness that deserve attention because silence can be a form of consent. When societies stop asking uncomfortable questions, injustices calcify and opportunities for improvement vanish. Cultivating a culture of questioning is therefore an act of civic care that preserves progress and democratic possibility. The citizen who asks is often the most consequential participant in public life. We have seen how questions operate across domains, from intimacy to institutions, from science to art. The through line is clear. Questions open possibility, while answers often close it prematurely. So the central lesson is practical and profound, simple and radical. Cultivate questions as daily tools for living rather than occasional philosophical curiosities. That change in practice reshapes how we think and how we act. In the end, asking better questions becomes an ethical practice that defines our relationships with truth and with one another. It is a form of intellectual hospitality that invites complexity and resists easy closure. The most important question we can ask might be, what kind of person do I want to become when I inquire? That question reframes inquiry as moral formation rather than mere information gathering. Questions will not always give us comfortable answers, and they will sometimes leave us with more ambiguity than when we began. Yet that ambiguity is not failure, but the raw material of wisdom when we treat it with patience. To live by questions is to accept uncertainty as the terrain of growth and to welcome others into the journey. It is to practice humility and courage at the same time. If this conversation has taught anything, it is that inquiry is a discipline of freedom rather than a path to certainty. Asking the right questions is how we orient toward truth, possibility, and moral growth. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. If you want more videos on thinking clearly and living wisely, join us for the next question.